Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are tackling something incredibly difficult, actually, a question that really sits heavy with anyone who's been through relational abuse.
That's a tough one.
Yeah. Why do we stay? Why does the self, even a really smart, capable self, get so deeply stuck in toxic relationships, even when logically it feels like annihilation?
Right. And we're going beyond the usual answers,
Yeah.
the simple bad boundaries or just fear.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission today is to really get into the weeds, the psychological architecture underneath it all, the sort of neurosymbolic wiring that holds people captive. We're focusing on mirrored psychic inversion theory, MPIT, and specifically this concept called the anticipatory stress reflex system, the ASR.
The ASR. And the sources describe this as the organizing gate, like the main filter for,
Yeah,
well, for everything.
pretty much. It shapes how you see threats, how you process what's happening in relationships, whether your inner world can even handle complexity without just shattering. It dictates the reality you end up living in.
Okay. And the challenge for you listening is that we're digging into a specific setup within this ASR system, a kind of triad.
Exactly. A triad that essentially forces the self into this defensive state, almost like a fantasy bubble. And paradoxically, that bubble, that collapse, is what keeps the person there. It's the invisible glue.
Prevents them from leaving. Okay, so let's unpack this triad. ASR1, ASR2, ASR3. Understanding the sequence here seems absolutely crucial to getting why this organizing gate works the way it does, especially in collapse.
It is. We need to see them developmentally, but also structurally. So ASR1, that's the annihilatory stress response. Think primal, infantile terror, before words, before symbols, just raw fragmentation.
The ground zero.
Right. Then there's ASR2, the
Right.
anticipatory stress reflex. This is the goal, really. The mature system, the symbolic filter that should be running the show in adulthood, letting us handle nuance and mixed feeling.
The gate working properly.
Yes. And then ASR3, the anticipatory shadow reflex. It's a defensive player. It's a dissociative fantasy state that kicks in only when that healthy ASR2 gate gets overwhelmed and fails. And that's where we see that why we stay dynamic really lock in.
Okay, let's start in the beginning then. ASR1, annihilatory stress response. You called it somatic ground zero, deep infancy stuff. How is this truly different from the fight, flight, freeze we always hear about?
That's the critical distinction right off the bat. Because ASR1 is structural. It's not really behavior. The F words, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, those are autonomic cascades. They're physiological actions the body takes in response to danger. They're regulated, observable.
Okay.
ASR1 is different. It's pre-symbolic, pre-narrative. It's happening before an infant can even form a story about why they feel bad or hold a stable picture of themselves as their caregiver.
So it's not just intense fear, it's like the body literally experiencing falling apart, internal disintegration.
Exactly that. It's the body recording its primal recognition of what Melanie Klein called annihilatory anxiety. And it's not fear of death, like we think of it as adults. It's the terror of psychic dissolution,
Oh.
of just vanishing, becoming nothing.
Wow.
It's the bodily truth of psychic death being encoded because the relational connection, that core bond, has fundamentally failed.
Think Fairbairn too. The bad object isn't just an idea you internalize, it's felt in the body as abandonment, as inherent badness.
Okay, that's intent. And there's a neurobiological basis for this, right? This isn't just theory. It's about how trauma physically shapes the developing brain.
Absolutely. We're talking about the early wiring, especially in the right hemisphere, which is so crucial for emotions and relationships. Areas like the orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC.
Which handles regulation and predicting outcomes in relationships.
Precisely. And the insular cortices, particularly the anterior insula, that's your interoception hub, your sense of what's happening inside your own body. Plus the amygdala, of course, the threat detector. So if an infant needs secure mirroring for those areas to develop properly, but instead gets chronic misattunement, neglect, abandonment, it physically warps those circuits.
That's exactly it. Early relational trauma messes with the functional connectivity, especially between the anterior insula and the amygdala. The amygdala is constantly yelling, threat. And the insula, which should give an accurate internal reading, becomes hypervigilant, maybe even rigid.
Leading to that feeling of constant internal scanning, like waiting for the other shoe to drop, even when things seem fine.
Yes, hypervigilant internal scanning, affective rigidity. The person feels fundamentally unsafe inside, regardless of the outside world. The system is stuck running on this deep nonverbal prediction error. I am not safe. It's encoded before language can even touch it.
Like the body knows something's wrong before the mind can name it.
It's the violence of being symbolically orphaned, really. That brain-body environment connection gets severed. The self gets stamped non-verbally with, I am defective, I am unprotected. And here's the kicker. ASR1, even though it's infantile, becomes the core that repeats in all adult collapse structures.
Because later betrayals, abandonments, they hit that same raw spot.
Exactly. Narcissistic abuse, particularly the discard phase, or a sudden betrayal that acts as a symbolic rupture, it shatters the unspoken contract of the relationship, and bam, it reactivates that primal ASR1 wound. Abandonment, derealization, it all comes flooding back.
And that pushes the person towards, what was it, CIPR?
Collapse-induced psychotic regression.
Yes.
It's the mind's desperate measure when faced with that ASR1 annihilation threat again, a temporary, terrifying breakdown of self, of reality testing.
That sounds chillingly familiar to what survivors describe during discard, feeling like they're losing their minds.
It is the mind trying not to shatter completely. And to prevent that shattering, ASR1 actually generates something called the false self-casing. This is a huge piece of why people stay or comply. It's a survival script, often built way back in childhood.
Okay, tell me more about this false self-casing. What is it exactly?
It's like a brittle identity, a defensive shell constructed around whatever emotional or relational needs were missing back then. It's kind of snapshotting the self adopts a frozen, often idealized image of whatever the environment or later the abuser seems to require.
Why? To prevent.
To prevent triggering ASR1 again, to ward off that annihilation. The logic is brutal, but simple. If I am exactly what is needed, compliant, perfect, invisible, whatever, then I won't be abandoned and I won't disintegrate.
So it bypasses truth, bypasses real connection.
For the sake of immediate false stability, it keeps the internal structure from breaking apart, even if the external reality is destructive. That casing is the first layer of why we stay.
Okay, so ASR1 is the bedrock fear, driving the need for this false self-casing. Now, let's move to ASR2. This is supposed to be the healthy, mature gate, the organizing gate as intended.
Right. ASR2 is the system that develops later. It's designed to be much more sophisticated. It integrates sensory input, those internal body signals from the insula, symbolic meaning, all of it.
And uses that to do what?
To anticipate stress in a more nuanced way, to manage our predictive emotional models, and critically, to allow us to tolerate symbolic ambivalence.
Symbolic ambivalence. Okay, break that down for us. What does that mean in practice?
It's the ability to hold conflicting feelings or realities at the same time without the whole system going haywire. Like knowing you love your partner but also feeling really frustrated with them sometimes, and being okay with both truths coexisting. It doesn't destroy the relationship, doesn't destroy your sense of self.
Ah, okay. It's like moving beyond black and white thinking.
It's exactly. Developmentally, it's the shift Melanie Klein talked about, from the paranoid schizoid position where everything is split into all good or all bad, to the depressive position where you can integrate the good and the bad aspects of someone, including yourself. ASR2 is the engine that makes that integration possible.
So when ASR2 is working well, we get nuance, patience, psychological adulthood, really. It allows for that pause, that symbolic delay between something happening and how we react. We can reflect, respond adaptively instead of just panicking.
Precisely. It's the foundation for actually testing reality properly and having some authorship over our own emotional responses.
Okay, so that's the ideal. Now, the crucial part for this discussion, what goes wrong? How does ASR2 fail in these toxic trauma bonding situations? Because you said this is the true start of why we stay.
Yes, this is where the structure really begins to collapse inwards. When significant relational trauma or narcissistic abuse hits someone with that underlying ASR1 vulnerability.
That fear of dissolution we talked about.
That fear gets reactivated hard. And the mature ASR2 gate, which needs time, safety, reflective space to work properly, it just gets bypassed, obliterated, essentially. The psyche cannot tolerate facing ASR1 head-on.
So it does what instead?
It defensively forms ASR3. It creates this alternate pathway, the shadow reflex, in a desperate attempt to defer the ASR1 annihilation.
Wow. Okay, so the real collapse isn't necessarily after the abuse is obvious. It's happening when ASR2 fails to process the warning signs, maybe even during the love bombing or idealization phase.
Absolutely. Think about that idealization phase. It's presented as perfect, flawless, right? No complexity. If ASR2 was fully online, it would register the nuance. Okay, this feels amazing, but something off here. This intensity seems unhealthy, maybe. Their story keeps changing.
But a compromised ASR2 can't hold that.
It collapses the ambivalence.
Yeah.
Any sign of imperfection, any loss of that all-good object feels like death, literally. These are what the theory calls ASR2 collapse events. The person might feel physical sensations like falling, unraveling, disappearing psychically, just because a slight negative was introduced.
And that failure to hold nuance, that keeps the fantasy going. Like Vaknin talks about with the shared fantasy denying reality to keep this perfect image intact.
ASR2 failing is the engine of that denial. Because the gate can't handle frustration or complexity, it actively pushes away the ASR1 trigger by substituting its own function with a defensive ASR3. The self, terrified of dissolving ASR1, unconsciously chooses the false stability of ASR3's fantasy structure over facing the truth, because the truth feels like annihilation.
So the choice isn't really I choose this abuser, it's I choose the ASR3 structure because it feels safer than facing the void threatened by ASR1. ASR3 becomes this functional delusion.
It's the path of least resistance,
Yeah.
psychologically speaking. It feels safer. ASR3 offers a kind of safety through compliance and mirroring, which ironically maintains the bond with the abuser, but in a completely distorted way. That's the true start of the collapse, prioritizing internal structural safety, ASR3, over processing external reality accurately, ASR2.
Okay, which brings us squarely into ASR3 territory, the anticipatory shadow reflex. You called it the neurosymbolic scar tissue. What's its main job? What's its organizing principle?
ASR3 is basically a maladaptive symbolic inversion. It flips things. It organizes the person's entire reality around predicting threat and managing shame, its core drive, symbolic invisibility,
Meaning?
meaning the reflexive automatic attempt to become whatever is required or perceived to be required to avoid pain, rejection, or triggering that ASR1 annihilation again.
Yeah.
If we link it back to the F words, ASR3 is like the deep structural, always-on version of fawn or freeze.
So it's not about seeking meaning or growth, it's about avoidance becoming your identity.
Exactly. ASR3 mediates avoidance of annihilation, not meaning. And the result, the person becomes reflectively self-invalidating. Their internal OS, instead of supporting thoughtful choices, as AR2, defaults to compliance, placation, strategically silencing the real self. This is why outsiders see it and think, why don't they just leave? Are they weak? They're seeing an involuntary structural compliance program running.
You mentioned the mind becoming a kind of relational simulation engine here.
ASR3 is that engine. It's constantly running simulations. What will get me disapproved of? How can I avoid that? It predistorts incoming information, relational cues, to fit the threat narrative and avoid re-traumatization. This learned simulation shows up as reflexive symbolic compliance.
Like automatically placating someone, blaming yourself instantly.
Yes, involuntary placation, immediate self-blame and conflict, and inability to hold even basic boundaries. The mind and body have learned to pass to perform the role of the perfect victim or the perfect compliant partner by conforming totally to the perceived demands, even if those demands make no sense.
Okay. This feels like the perfect moment to bring in the intrapsychic activation model, IPM. Because ASR3 explains the mechanism of compliance, but IPM seems to explain the motivation, the emotional investment that keeps it running. This feels central to why we stayed.
It absolutely is. They work together. MPIT explains the structure. IPM explains the why. IPM suggests we all have multiple self states. The successful self, the capable self, but also maybe a victim self state or a loser self state. And here's a crucial, often counterintuitive part. People become deeply emotionally invested in maintaining whichever self state is currently active, even if that state is painful.
Wait, why? Why on earth would anyone be invested in feeling like a victim or a loser? That sounds backwards.
Because the absolute #1 non-negotiable priority of our psychological system is to reduce anxiety. If someone's entire relational history has been shaped by that ASR1 terror and the resulting false self-casing, their most stable, familiar identity might actually be coded as the one who fails, or the one who isn't worthy,
Right.
or the victim.
Success or being treated well feels threatening.
It creates massive dissonance. It destabilizes the core self-state. Feeling competent, loved, or safe might paradoxically trigger more anxiety because it conflicts with the established safe because familiar identity. The system hates that dissonance.
So it chooses the familiar pain because that pain, however awful, actually reduces the anxiety of the self-concept dissolving. Failure validates the loser self-state, and that brings relief.
That's the brutal core mechanism. Failure restores internal harmony, even if it's a harmony based on misery. The construct that's the mental filter attached to the active self-state actively filters memory, perception, interpretation, everything to uphold that self-state.
So if the active state is victim,
Then staying in the abusive dynamic, experiencing more victimization, actually validates that identity. It confirms the construct. This is structural survival, not conscious choice. The person is performing the safest self, the ASR3 logic, to keep that ASR1 annihilatory anxiety at bay. And this feeds directly into the shared fantasy because the fantasy and its eventual inevitable collapse confirms the pre-existing familiar safe self-state.
Okay, let me make sure I really understand this because this feels like the answer for so many people listening. So, if a survivor gets a chance to escape or maybe achieve something good, the ASR3 compliance kicks in, and the IPM drive means they might unconsciously sabotage it just to keep their loser self-state stable and reduce that internal dissonance. Can you give us a concrete example?
Sure, let's imagine a survivor whose dominant active self-state is, say, the failure who messes everything up. They get a fantastic job, offers stable, respectful, validating, everything their conscious mind wants.
Right. An outsider sees that as purely good news.
But internally,
Hmm.
existential panic. ASR1 alarm bells start ringing because the very foundation of their safe identity is threatened. The construct linked to the failure immediately activates those inner critics, those interjects voices saying, you can't handle this, you'll blow it, you're an imposter.
And then what happens? How does the sabotage play out?
Driven by the need to reduce that terrifying anxiety, they might unconsciously create the failure. Maybe they forget the final interview or misread the offer details or suddenly find fault with the job. Oh, it's too stressful. It's not really me, and withdraw.
And the outcome is they don't get the job. They fail.
Yes. And in that moment of failure, there's a paradoxical, often unconscious sense of relief. The anxiety plummets. The internal system stabilizes because the failure self-state is concerned. They've restored harmony, even though it's the harmony of defeat. They choose predictable pain over catastrophic anxiety of success that doesn't match the self-concept. The goal becomes achieving outcomes, even negative ones, that validate the self-state.
Wow. That structural need for consistent pain just to avoid challenging the self-concept, that explains so much seemingly irrational behavior. It's not about loving the abuse, it's about protecting the only identity that feels survivable, however broken it is.
Protecting the self-concept is the prime directive. And the ASR3 compliance mechanism ensures the survivor clings to the external reality, the abusive dynamic that best mirrors and validates the internal safe reality defined by that trauma-coded self-state.
Okay. So ASR3 is the defense, IPAM provides the motivation, but ASR3 relies on that external source, the abuser, for its structure. What happens when that anchor is ripped away? Discard, betrayal, exposure.
That's the collapse event. And it's characterized by something MPIT calls gaze collapse. See, ASR3 needs the abuser's gaze, their attention, validation, criticism, even just their presence as its organizing principle, its anchor. When that's suddenly gone,
The simulation crashes.
the whole ASR3 symbolic simulation fails.
Utterly.
The system loses its last external organizing point and is left completely exposed to that raw underlying ASR1 terror. The person can no longer predict safety through compliance because the source of the rules is gone.
This has gotta feel like more than just a bad breakup. What are the actual felt effects? What do survivors report during gaze collapse?
Oh, it's acute psychic distress. The risk of CIPR, the collapse-induced psychotic regression, skyrockets. People report profound derealization, depersonalization, feeling unreal, unmoored, like they don't exist outside the relationship that just vanished.
Like floating in space.
Exactly. Affective blackouts can happen, emotion just shuts down. Or the opposite, overwhelming panic states, often with what are called symbolic hallucinations.
Symbolic hallucinations. What are those?
It's when the mind, desperate for any organizing structure, starts misinterpreting neutral things as confirmation of the trauma narrative. Seeing betrayal in a random gesture, hearing a phone ring, and instantly knowing with certainty it's the abuser contacting someone else. Hyperspecific paranoid meanings attached to benign stimuli.
It sounds like the mind just scrambling.
It is scrambling. It's spiraling through the failed system. ASR1 terror erupts. ASR2 tries to process reality, but defaults back to ASR3, frantically trying to find a compliance pattern, even when there's nothing to comply with. It's a dizzying, terrifying loop.
And this ASR3 failure, this gaze collapse, leads into what's called the paracosmic internal world, the Hall of Mirrors.
Yes. Because without the external anchor, the internal world, already structured by ASR3, becomes this closed loop. The Hall of Mirrors is where authentic contact with reality or new people becomes almost impossible. The internal landscape is completely dominated by introjects.
Those internalized voices or representations of the abuser's demands.
Exactly. Distorted representations, critical tapes playing on repeat. In this internal hall, Every new person, every situation isn't seen for what it is. It's just reflected back as a variation of the past trauma filtered through those interjects. No genuine connection can get in or out.
So the interject isn't just a background thought, it's like an active agent that the construct uses.
Precisely. The construct, remember, is still attached to that dominant self-state, say, the victim or the failure. Even without the abuser present, the construct needs evidence to keep that self-state stable. So it calls upon specific interjects, those internalized critical voices, often sounding just like the abuser, to generate automatic thoughts.
Like, you deserve this, or you'll always be alone.
Exactly. And those thoughts aren't random. They are generated by the interject on behalf of the construct, specifically to validate the painful self-state and restore that awful internal consistency.
Good grief. And this machinery, the construct filtering everything, calling on interjects, makes real recovery seem almost impossible.
It creates immense symbolic friction. The construct will warp memories, drain positive events of their emotional impact, highlight failures, anything to keep the dominant self-state locked in place. This constant internal simulation, this hall of mirrors, is why survivors often feel like they can't trust their own minds, their own feelings.
Which explains why recovery is rarely, if ever, a straight line. That false self-casing, the ASR3 structure, it doesn't just vanish when you leave the relationship.
No way. It's the safety default setting. That false self, built on ASR3 logic, will absolutely flare up again. In moments of high stress, new relationships, times when vulnerability or authenticity is needed, you get these snapback moments.
Where the old compliant self-sabotaging script just takes over automatically.
Yes. And it's crucial for survivors to understand that snapback is not a failure of recovery. It's the old organizing gate, ASR3, reasserting itself because it feels safer than the uncertainty of ASR2's authenticity. Healing requires moving off that horizontal plane of mirrors and interjects, ASR3, and back towards the vertical axis, rebuilding and reactivating the mature, reality-testing ASR2 gate.
This has been, wow, a really deep dive into the mechanics of being trapped. Let's try and synthesize this one last time. The question was, why do we stay? What's the ASR IPAM connection boiled down?
Boiled down, it's a trauma-coded survival script, plain and simple, not lack of will. The primal fear of ASR1 annihilation forces the self to ditch the healthy ASR2 gate and adopt the ASR3 compliance strategy. And that strategy is fueled, emotionally, by the IPM mechanism, the deep investment in maintaining a familiar, albeit painful self-state like the victim or the loser.
Because that internal consistency feels less dangerous than the anxiety of the self-concept shattering?
Exactly. The system prioritizes predictable pain, which maintains the self-state, over the terrifying uncertainty of challenging that state, even if challenging it means health or happiness. The survival mechanism is paradoxically designed to choose failure to maintain internal stability.
The genius and the absolute horror of it.
Which means recovery has to be structural, not just about positive thinking. It demands symbolic reconstruction. You have to name ASR3. You have to identify those snapback moments when the false self grabs the wheel. And you have to consciously, deliberately work to restore ASR2.
Through what? How do you restore ASR2?
Through symbolic truth-telling, building a strong, grounded external narrative that directly contradicts the Hall of Mirrors. It involves interoceptive retraining, reclaiming ownership of your body's signals, narrative reclamation, challenging those interjects, and crucially, relational repair, experiencing safe, consistent, securely mirrored interactions that prove the ASR1, ASR3 predictions wrong.
So it's a total system overhaul, moving from just reacting based on the old script to actually having authorship over your responses.
Authorship over reaction, that's the goal. And, we often think of trauma as just bad memories or messed up emotions. But MPIT frames it as a fundamental structural misalignment. Our brain uses predictive coding, essentially creating a controlled hallucination of self and world to keep us stable.
But if your core symbolic gate, your ASR, is inverted, if ASR3 is running the show,
then how can you ever truly trust what you see, feel, or remember? It throws everything into question. What does it even mean to have a self if that self is just a mirrored construct, a performance designed purely to avoid annihilation rather than an authentic author of its own experience?
That really is the final provocative question, isn't it? What does it take to reclaim authorship when your very identity was built as a defense mechanism? It means facing that ASR1 terror, perhaps, and daring to dismantle the only safe structure you've ever known.
It means courageously, repeatedly, introducing new, safe, undeniable data experiences of security, validation, nuance into the system, until the ASR2 gate finally recalibrates and starts to believe a different reality is possible. A reality where you are safe, complex, and whole. It's the ultimate act of internal structural remodeling.
A structural problem demanding a deep structural solution. Thank you. This has been incredibly insightful and
It
necessary.
was my pleasure. It's vital work to understand.
For the deep dive, we'll be back next time. Thanks for joining us.